Good afternoon, everyone. My name is William von Handorf, and I'm a senior McConnell Scholar here at the University of Louisville. And at the McConnell Center, we believe in the power of reading. President Truman once said, "Every reader will not be a leader, but every leader must be a reader." We certainly subscribe to that ideology, and we encourage you to read along with us. Education should never end. There are always great books that are waiting to change your life. So please like this video, subscribe to this series, and visit us at www.mcconnellcenter.org to join our conversation, especially by listening to our two podcasts, Vital Remnants and the McConnell Center podcast. But our focus today is on Dante's Divine Comedy. I am honored to introduce the leader of today's seminar, Dr. Andrew Rabin. Dr. Rabin has been a member of the English faculty here at the University of Louisville since 2005. Before that, he earned his Ph.D. from the University of Chicago. While he is extremely knowledgeable about all periods and forms of literature, his work focuses on law and literature of early medieval England, and he's written countless books and articles, including Crime and Punishment in Early Medieval England, Wulfstan, Old English Legal Writing, and many more. Dr. Rabin is a wonderful friend of the McConnell Center, and he'll be leading our Dante sessions for the rest of the year. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rabin.
All right, thank you very much, Will, for that very kind introduction. Thanks to the McConnell Center for inviting me to do this once again. It is always a thrill and one of the highlights of my year to be able to come and talk to all of you, whether it's about Dante, whether it's about Virgil, whether it's about Beowulf or Gawain and the Green Knight. This is truly one of the highlights of my career here at U of L. But most of all, thank you to all of you for giving up some time on your Friday to spend some time with me and some time with Dante Alighieri. As I think you'll find, the Inferno and the Commedia as a whole is a remarkable poem, and reading it is a remarkable experience. This is the sort of poem that doesn't just entertain or enlighten. This is the sort of poem that changes your life. I often tell my students that the definition of literature, the definition of great literature, is that literature is how we explain ourselves to ourselves. It's how we try to make sense of the messy, incoherent, contradictory, paradoxical experience of living. Great literature helps us think about new ways to do that, gives us new ways to understand ourselves. But truly great literature, the literature of a Shakespeare or a Homer, or for that matter, a Dante Alighieri, truly great literature wipes the slate clean. Once you read Dante, you can't go back. There's no world before Dante. You can't return to that state of mind. Dante changes you. Dante brings you to a better, more enlightened, and perhaps most importantly, more human place. Dante teaches us about compassion. He teaches us about love. He teaches us about grace. Dante teaches us not just about the world he lived in the 14th century, but also how to better interact in the world we live in today, how to better interact as citizens, how to better interact with that world as family members, as brothers, sisters, fathers, sons, daughters, mothers. He teaches us how to better interact with that world as friends. He teaches us how to better understand our place as mortals in an infinite cosmos. Dante is a poet to be loved, and his poems are works to be loved. And so I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to talk about Dante with you. So where to begin? I think the best place to begin is actually in the year 1301. In the year 1301, the 36-year-old Dante, he is a member of the Florentine upper classes. He is a politician, he is a diplomat, he is part of the Florentine governing council. And in this year, he's sent off to Rome on a diplomatic mission to Pope Boniface VIII. When he departs Florence, he doesn't realize that he will never see his home again. While he's gone, his enemies will arrange for him to be tried and found guilty of various crimes and penalized to permanent exile he will never again be allowed to return to Florence. And even today, his body lies not in Florence, but in Ravenna. This experience of exile, this experience of being a permanent wanderer, this experience of losing a home that you love and can never return to, it's this experience that will shape the Divine Comedy, that will make it into the great poem that we know of it today. Because the experience of exile for Dante is not just his own experience. It's the experience of all of us who feel exiled from God, exiled from love, exiled from society, exiled from our friends and family. It's a poem for those of us who've experienced loneliness and loss and desire to find again the wonderful, magical, beautiful experience of love and being belonging. This is a poem of pilgrimage and exile. It's a poem of refugeeship. And ultimately, it's a poem about finding your way to the place where you most belong. But what is it that, how do we know that this is such a significant poem? Well, we can just think a little bit just about the impact of the Divine Comedy. In the words of the poet T.S. Eliot, the great modernist poet, Dante and Shakespeare divide the world between them. There's no third. There's nobody else who so captures the experience of living for Eliot as Dante and Shakespeare. For Jorge Luis Borges, the Commedia is the greatest book ever published. For Thomas Carlyle, the 19th century author, Dante is world great not because he is worldwide, but because he is world deep. Not just because he addresses every aspect of the human experience, but because he drives so deep into the human experience that he gets right at that core of what makes us human. Dante was a favorite author of writers such as Petrarch, Boccaccio, Chaucer, Milton, Tennyson, Longfellow, James Joyce, C.S. Lewis, whom I know you've been reading here at the McConnell Center. He's a favorite author of contemporary poets such as Robert Pinsky, Seamus Heaney, Rosanna Warren, Mary Jo Bang, W.S. Merwin, and Jacqueline Osherow. Not to mention Dave Mustaine, the founder and lead guitarist of the band Megadeth. Rock and roll. This is one of the most important love poems ever written. This is a poem about what it means to be in love, and in many ways our language of love, our language of passion and ecstasy. It comes from Dante. This is a poem that virtually invents the idea of experiential poetry. We experience the journey through hell, purgatory, and heaven just as Dante does, just at the same time Dante does. We are his companion on that journey. The emotions he experiences are the emotions we experience. This is, more than any poem written previously, an immersive poem, an immersive work of literature. We are present to the action, and just as Dante grows and changes over the course of his experience, so also do we. This is a foundational work in the history of fantasy literature. Dante is the pioneer of world building. There's no Middle Earth without the Divine Comedy, one of J.R.R. Tolkien's favorite works of literature. But its significance is not limited just to literature. For those who are students of politics, the Divine Comedy is one of the foundational pieces of political satire, of the use of literature to skewer those in power. Perhaps more importantly, the Divine Comedy is one of the most profound explorations of the idea of freedom, not just artistic freedom or political freedom, but the freedom of the intellect and the freedom of the soul. The freedom to look at society, to look at the leaders of society, to look at the norms and mores of society and say, yes, these are good, these are virtuous, but also the freedom to look at society and the laws of society and the mores of society and say, no, these are wrong, these are sinful, these are oppressive, these are repressive. I choose something different. The Divine Comedy as a Christian poem is, of course, one of the most profound statements of theology ever composed. Not just in the sense that it embodies certain themes that are central to the Christian experience, but also because of so much of what we today think of as heaven and hell and purgatory comes less from the Bible, less from the works of early patristic commentators than it does from the Divine Comedy, this image of heaven, purgatory, and hell as organized into rings, as organized into levels according to sins and virtues, in which punishments and rewards are keyed directly into the particular sin of which you are guilty or the particular virtue that defines your character. This all comes to us from Dante. When you think about the afterlife, odds are what you're thinking of is as much Dante as it is the Bible. But of course, Dante isn't even just a Christian poet. Dante's sources are not merely Christian. Dante draws extensively from Hebrew sources, from Arabic sources. Dante has tremendous respect for Jewish and Islamic authors. When he creates his themes, when he crafts his poem, he's writing a Christian poem. He's writing a poem in praise of a Christian notion of God. But his view of that God, his conception of that God, comes from more than just Christianity. And one of the things we find in his poem is a remarkable perspective on the virtues not just of Christianity, but of other religions and other belief systems as well. This is a poem that's foundational in the history of psychology. This is the first great testament to the therapeutic power of literature, to the idea that to work through one's personal crises, one's traumas, one's experience of oneself, you have to tell your story. This is one of the things that Dante gives us. But of course, we're not even limited to the humanities and social sciences. It's through the reading of Dante and the attempt to actually map out what the physical size of hell would be that a young physicist named Galileo Galilei first proposes what will later be called the idea of scale invariance, the idea that the laws of objects or motion do not change even if size or length or energy or other variables are multiplied by a common factor. But perhaps Dante's greatest contributions lie first in the field of linguistics and second in the field of philosophy. First, linguistics. It's important to know that when you talk about Dante, we often talk about Dante as an Italian author. But Dante wasn't an Italian author. Italy existed as a peninsula in Dante's time, but it didn't exist as a single political entity. Dante was a Florentine. Dante traveled among Romans and Venetians and Genoans. Dante's identity and the identity of the others who inhabited, his fellow citizens who inhabited the Italian peninsula, were defined by city-states. Yet Dante saw the possibility of a different identity. When Dante wrote, he wrote in the Tuscan dialect, but he referred to it as something called Italian. Dante imagined language as a unifier of community. Dante imagined the idea of what he called a golden vernacular, a vernacular language that would be shared by all people, certainly in the Italian peninsula, that would bring them together, that would create a commonality of culture, a commonality of literature, a commonality of language, that would eventually lead to a more peaceful, a more unified society. But what about philosophy? Well, this is connected to that contribution he makes in linguistics. Dante is the first poet in the Western tradition to make the argument that serious philosophical questions, that serious theological questions, could be addressed in vernacular literature. Prior to Dante, the language of philosophy, the language of theology was Latin. It was the language of the learned classes. It was the language of the upper classes. It was the language of the church. Dante was a phenomenal Latinist, don't get me wrong. Much of his work is written in Latin, and as a stylist, he's second to none. But Dante also saw that the vernacular, the language of the common people, had just as much power to move the mind and to move the soul. That you could capture themes just as broad, just as deep, just as wide in common literature as you could in Latin. And that's reflected in the style of the Commedia. We often think of the Commedia as great literature, which makes it sound something like medicine, something that you have to swallow but won't necessarily enjoy very much. Dante wrote his poem to be enjoyed. It's written not just in passages of remarkable literary sublimity, but also in passages of slang, passages of low comedy. There is slapstick, there are jokes and puns, there are moments of terror, there are moments that will appeal to every aspect of the human soul and the emotional experience. This is poetry to be read and enjoyed. Dante wrote this poem so that anybody could read it. And even today, when you encounter Dante, it's almost too bad if you first encounter him in a class, because then you lose the opportunity to really understand this poem as literature that's addressing you, each of you directly. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't attend the seminars I'm going to be offering for the next couple of months, but it is to say that when you approach this poem, approach it not just as a great work of literature, but approach it with the kind of attitude that you would approach anything you would read for fun. Whether it's a mystery novel, a romance novel, a horror novel, whether it's Stephen King or, oh goodness, I'm not the best person to ask on contemporary popular literature, but whoever is popular out there. Because Dante has parts of all of those authors inside his poem. This poem is just an amazing read. And that's really the best thing you can say about it. It has a rollicking plot. It has moments that will shock you. It has moments that will drive you to emotional ecstasy. It has moments that will make you sob. It has moments that will make you laugh with joy. This is a poem, as I've already said, to be loved. So who is the man who wrote this poem? Well, Dante is born probably, we don't know for certain, but probably in May of 1265. He's born in Florence to an upper-class Florentine family. Now, when he is about 9 years old, he will encounter at a birthday party a young girl by the name of Beatrice Portinari. This encounter, this experience of meeting this girl, even at the very young age of 9, Dante will say changes his life. He will write that at that moment, his new life began because it's that moment he first knew love and beauty. Dante will, in fact, not grow up to marry Beatrice. They will encounter each other periodically over the years. She will remain as Dante's muse. She will remain in Dante's head, in Dante's mind, as the epitome, not just of romantic love, but as true love, transcendent love. The love that drives us to be better people, better philosophers, better Christians, to truly appreciate the divine in the world and in our souls. Now, as Dante matures, Dante will enjoy poetry. Dante will write poetry. Dante will fall in with a group of poets who are writing a new kind of vernacular poetry about love and philosophy that will be called the poetry of the sweet new style, the dolce stil nuovo. But fundamentally, Dante is being raised as a leader of Florentine society. He will be expected to participate in Florentine politics. He will be expected to participate in the leading of Florentine society. Now, Florentine society, Florence at this period, is riven with conflict. It's divided early in Dante's life between two political parties, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Now, the reasons for their divisions look to us today as essentially minor political disputes. Disputes about how Florence should be run and with whom should Florence be aligned politically. But in Dante's day, these disputes were serious enough to spark a civil war. Dante himself will serve as a cavalryman in the battle in which the Ghibellines are finally defeated. Now, you would think that with the triumph of Dante's party, the Guelphs, this would bring Florence a respite from conflict. But in fact, it doesn't. The Guelphs themselves then divide into two groups that will be associated with colors, the black Guelphs and the white Guelphs. Dante will be associated with the white Guelphs. Now, he will become a member of the Florentine ruling commission. Florence is governed during this period not by a king or by a single aristocrat, but by essentially a ruling council. He will serve on this council, and in the year 1300, he will actually spend 2 months as the prior of Florence, essentially as the chair of the council. He will date this moment, these 2 months, as among the worst of his life. He will say that it's in these 2 months that the seeds for all of his sorrows were planted. Now, in 1301, as I said, Dante will be sent on a diplomatic mission to Rome. While he's gone, the Black Guelphs will seize power and arrange for Dante to be exiled. They will threaten that he will be burned at the stake should he ever reappear in Florence. And so he will begin his period as a wanderer, a period that will last the last 20 years of his life. It's during this period as a wanderer that most of Dante's literary production will occur. Most importantly, starting in around 1306 or 1308, it's not quite clear, but somewhere in that window, Dante will begin composing his great work, what he will call the commedia, the comedy, what we think of, or what we have named the Divine Comedy. A journey of one person through the entire cosmos, through hell, purgatory, and heaven, every place a human soul could end up, a poem encompassing every aspect of the human experience. The Inferno, the first part of the Commedia, will first circulate around about the year 1314. It will immediately be a success. Over the course of the rest of his life, Dante will work on Purgatorio and Paradiso. He will eventually die in the year 1321 in the city of Ravenna. It is unclear whether Purgatorio and Paradiso were completely finished by the time Dante passed away. There's some dispute about that in his biographies, but certainly from our perspective, it's hard to see how these poems could have been more complete or more finished. They are all perfectly remarkable. The Commedia consists of 3 cantici, essentially 3 books, right? Hell, Purgatory, and Paradise. Now, it tells you something about Dante as a craftsman. When I say that each cantica, each book of the Commedia, is made up of 33 cantos, with an additional single introductory canto at the beginning of Inferno to make an even 100. Each canto will be made up of rhyming tercets, 3-line segments. Each of these tercets will contain 33 syllables, the same number of syllables as there are cantica or canti in each of the poems. Each realm, hell, purgatory, and heaven, will be built around the number 9. The 9 rings of hell, the 9 levels of purgatory, and the 9 celestial bodies of paradise. Each book of the Commedia ends with the same word. They each end with the word stars. Because as Dante wants to remind us, no matter where you are over the course of your journey, you always are looking up. You're always being driven, impelled forward towards the heavens. Dante is very precise in his poem, not just in its construction, but also in its timing. Dante sets his poem between Maundy Thursday, the Thursday before Easter, and Easter morning in the year 1300. Now, remember what happened in the year 1300. 1300 was the year that Dante served as prior of the city of Florence. It was the year that he had that experience that he said was the seed for all of his sorrows. So he sets his poem right at a moment of personal crisis. And so it's appropriate that the poem begins with perhaps the most famous first lines in all of literature. Midway in the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. Ah, how hard it is to tell the nature of that wood, savage, dense, and harsh. The very thought of it renews my fear. What makes these lines so remarkable? Well, let's start with that pronoun right in that first line, midway in the journey of our life. Why does Dante say our? Well, at one level, this is simply an indication of Dante's age. Dante's 35 years old. The Bible says that each person is allotted 70 years and 10 in their lifetime. Sadly, Dante himself will die at the age of 56. But insofar as you are allotted 70 years and 10, insofar as we're all allotted that, midway through the journey of our life, 35 years old. Yet, it's more than that, too. Because it's not just midway through the journey of his life, it's our life. We're also present on this journey. His experience on this journey is our experience. By connecting the individual, those individual moment in Dante's life, the particular age Dante was at that moment, the particular day and year on which this poem occurs, by connecting that degree of specificity with the general, with the common, with the shared experience of all of his readers, that's how Dante makes the connection between the literal plot of this poem, what happens to this character Dante, and the shared experience, the allegorical meaning of the poem, the shared experience of his readers. This is how Dante makes that connection between what happens to him and what happens to all of us. Now, this opening is even more exceptional, just even beyond just that opening pronoun. One of the striking things about this opening is that even though Dante is very clearly in a mystical space, this mysterious wood, he never says, I had a dream and I was in this wood. He never says, once upon a time, I was in a wood. He never makes any indication to his readers that he's writing literature. I mean, certainly we know he's writing literature. We can look at the page and see that this is a poem. We certainly know that one day I found myself in a wood. That's not the opening of a memoir necessarily, or a history. But nonetheless, he doesn't engage in any of the rhetorical maneuvers you often find at the beginning of a story that allow you to separate yourself from the plot. When an author writes, once upon a time, your mind immediately thinks, oh, okay, I know what's happening. I'm reading a fairy tale. Dante doesn't allow us that separation. Dante immediately immerses us in the plot. We start not by thinking, okay, I'm going to sit down now and read a poem about this guy Dante, who's going to go on this amazing journey. We sit down thinking, wait a second, why am I in a wood? Why am I experiencing feelings of fear and horror and terror? What's going on? Why am I in a wood that he's savage, dense, and harsh? What's happened to him? And what's happening to me? It allows Dante to connect his experience of crisis with that universal feeling that we've all felt, that feeling of being lost, that feeling of being separated from those who loved you, those who make your home a home, those who make your family a family. He connects it to that experience in all of us, in that moment when we look around and realize, I may know what the right thing to do is, I may know what the right path to follow is, but suddenly I realize I've strayed from that path. Suddenly I realize that I'm not the virtuous person I thought I was. I realized that in all of the compromises, in all of the little minor excusable sins that we commit over the course of our everyday life, not even thinking about these, not even reflecting on these, I've slowly, step by step, been led into mortal terror. I've lost my way. How can I find my way home again? And if I don't find my way home again, does that mean that I'll be lost forever? Does that mean that, in fact, in this life of ours, there's no way out? Dante's goal is to show us the way out. Dante's poem is a poem of exile, but it's also a poem of hope. It's a poem of depression, but it's a poem about recovery from that depression. It's a poem about being a sinner, but a poem also about repenting of your sins and learning how to be a better human being more worthy of love, a human being more worthy of salvation. Now, as Dante's lost in this wood, he can't find his way out on his own. And suddenly there appears before him the great poet Virgil, author of the epic poem, the Aeneid. Virgil is one of Dante's favorite poets, and a poet upon whom Dante models himself. So it's appropriate that Virgil would then become his guide. Virgil tells Dante that he has been sent to Dante by none other than Beatrice herself. That even though Dante has lost his path, Beatrice still has confidence that he can find his way again, still has confidence in his love for her and her love for him. And therefore, she's helping Dante to find a way out by sending him a guide. Virgil will then take Dante out of the wood and down into hell. The first couple of sins that Dante, or the first couple of regions that Dante encounters in hell, tell us a great deal about Dante's moral vision. In fact, the first people he encounters in hell are not, well, they're not sinners per se. They're people who aren't even good enough to get into hell. They're the uncommitted. They're the people who never did anything good or did anything bad in their lives. They're people who never made a moral choice, who always retreated from it. People for whom we can feel nothing but contempt, because these are the people who never even developed as moral characters, moral human beings, moral selves. These are the people who couldn't be bothered. When Dante first enters hell, the first community of actual, well, We will call them sinners, but Dante doesn't quite see them that way. The first space in hell is limbo, a place of neutrality. This is the space of the virtuous pagans, the people who could never have known Christ, the people who could never have become Christians. It's here that Dante encounters figures such as Homer, Horace, and Ovid, Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato, the great philosophers and authors and scientists and leaders who shaped the Western world, shaped the world that Dante lived in, but existed before the advent of Jesus. But there's something very strange about the people he encounters here. They're not quite in heaven, they're not quite in hell. They're stuck in this sort of limbo for all eternity. It's not great, but it's not punishment either. It's a null space. But what's interesting is that in this space, he also encounters the great Islamic thinker Averroes, the great Islamic king and warrior Saladin. In this space, for people who could not have known Christ, he includes essentially people who are conceived of as the great enemies of Christianity, at least from the perspective of the normal Christian world of 14th century Italy. Dante sees in these men a certain degree of significance, a certain degree of virtue that may not give them salvation. It may leave them perpetually exiled from God, but it also does not make them worthy of punishment, of the horrors that's going to follow for the true sinners he's going to encounter in the subsequent levels of hell. Interestingly, he will encounter more pagans and non-Christians when he moves on to Purgatory and even into Paradiso. So even though this is a Christian poem, even though Dante is very clear that the only way to find your way to salvation is through faith in Christ, he also recognizes a few interesting and notable exceptions. Dante will then proceed through hell with Virgil as his guide. Now, hell as a space is defined primarily by despair. What does it mean to be in hell? It means that not only are you experiencing really terrible punishments, but the greatest punishment of all is that you have no hope of them ever ending. You have no hope of being redeemed, no hope of salvation, no hope in the future. The gates to hell are marked with perhaps the most famous phrase, or one of the most famous phrases of all time, not just because it's so memorable, but also because it appears on the office doors of professors all over this great land of ours. Abandon hope, all ye who enter here. To be in hell is to have lost all hope. As Dante travels through hell, he will encounter some remarkable characters, some characters that are among the most vivid, among the most memorable in all of literature. He'll encounter the tragic lovers, Paolo and Francesca, whose adulterous affair will lead them to be blown about in the winds of their own lust, never finding a space of safety and security. He will encounter Homer's Ulysses. He'll encounter Attila the Hun. He'll encounter Pontius Pilate. He'll encounter the great knight Bertrand de Born, carrying his own decapitated head and swinging it around rather like a lantern. He'll encounter Mordred from the Arthurian legends. He'll encounter the cannibalistic Count Ugolino, who devoured his own children and is sentenced to punishment that he must eternally stay in hell, gnawing on the head of his great enemy, the Archbishop Ruggiero. He will encounter corrupt popes, corrupt kings, corrupt leaders. He will encounter those who not only betray themselves, but those who betray their communities And most importantly, of course, those who betray their countries and those who betray God. Dante the exile, Dante the man who's been accused of being a traitor, he shows us he knows what true betrayal is. Inferno culminates with Dante and Virgil finding themselves on a great lake of ice. And there, gazing upon it, is none other than Lucifer himself, chewing in his demonic jaws the souls of the truly archetypal traitors, Cassius and Brutus, the assassins of Julius Caesar, and most importantly, Judas, the betrayer of Christ. Yet the poem does not end in hell. The poem ends with Virgil and Dante emerging out of hell, having a chance, having the opportunity, having the hope necessary to see the stars. From there, they begin climbing the mountain of Purgatory. In Purgatory, we encounter really the same sins that we encountered in hell. But here we perceive not unredeemable sinners, but those sinners who still have hope, those sinners who, through repentance, through prayer, can wipe away their sins and eventually make it to paradise, who can eventually make it to salvation. So Dante has passed through the space where you cannot escape your sin, and he comes to the space where eventually you can, if you are redeemable, if you are capable of penance, if you do have the moral strength and the commitment necessary, that you can overcome your sins. Purgatorio culminates with Dante entering the Garden of Eden, and there he finally encounters Beatrice herself. He's finally reunited with his love. Beatrice, when he meets her, is wearing the colors red, white, and green, symbolizing the virtues of charity, hope, and faith. These are the same colors that will later appear on the Italian flag. Beatrice will then guide Dante into paradise. In paradise, Dante will ascend through the celestial bodies, encountering the notion of true virtue, what it means to be a truly good person, to be somebody truly worthy of salvation, to know what we aspire to as humans. Eventually, even Beatrice will cease to be his guide. She will be restored to her place in the heavens. And his final guide will be St. Bernard, the great Christian theologian, who will eventually guide him into the very presence of God himself. Now, of course, as a mortal, Dante can't look directly upon God. All he sees is God's Empyrean, the light that's shining from the divine presence. And Dante gives a name for this light. He describes it as the love that moves the sun and other stars. Ultimately, for Dante, this may be his most important message. What is it that moves the universe? Love. Divine love. We started the Commedia at a specific moment in time, at a specific moment in Dante's life. We end it at a moment of pure universality. We end it at the moment when we stand with Dante, also seeing the love that moves the sun and other stars. This is the Inferno in miniature, but it's impossible to truly summarize the Inferno. Every moment is something different. This is an eventful poem. It's impossible to truly summarize the entire Commedia. The whole thing is an eventful poem. Stuff happens. A lot of stuff happens. This is a poem with a tremendous plot. Dante takes us on a remarkable journey. And what for me, I think, is most important about that journey, what makes that journey so powerful, is that Dante does something that it's hard to think of another author before him having done. And what Dante does is encapsulated all the way back at the beginning at those first lines, midway through the journey of our life. There's a particular genre of literature that begins midway through something. It's the genre of literature for which Virgil is most famous, the classical epic. But here's the thing about classical epics. The heroes of classical epics they're not like you and me. They're not regular mortals. They're the descendants of gods. We could never be an Achilles. It's probably good. Achilles didn't live such a great life. We could never be an Odysseus. We could be a Dante. We too could, and indeed for many of us have taken a journey like this. The Commedia is, among many things, the epic of the individual human soul. And that, I think, is where its greatest power lies. The fact that it allows us, however ordinary we are, however pedestrian our experience, to connect with something greater than ourselves, to see in ourselves that spark of divine love, to see in ourselves that core that not only makes us human, but that core of soul that we share with all humanity. We live in an age of tremendous division. We live in an age of existential terror. Let's face it, it's really, really tough to be alive right now. Dante also wrote in a time when it was difficult to be alive. Dante also wrote in a period and in circumstances of tremendous insecurity and instability. And Dante saw beyond them. And in seeing beyond them, he teaches us to see beyond them also. He teaches us to look at the world and to look at each other and recognize ourselves as a shared people, a shared species, that we have a common experience that joins us together. He teaches us to look at each other with compassion, understanding, and grace. He teaches us how, eventually, if we try hard enough, if we reflect hard enough, if we do what we can to be as virtuous as possible, we too, like Dante, can someday stand in the presence of the love that moves the sun and other stars. Thank you very much.